Welcome to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. Today's guest is Robert Jackman. He is a psychotherapist, Reiki Master, hypnotherapist, past life regressionist, and author of Healing Your Lost Inner Child. Today we're going to talk about his near-death experience and how his own past life regressions have influenced his life. Robert, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Johnny. I'm glad to be with you.
Excellent. What was it specifically that attracted you to past life regression?
Well, I think it was really to help me understand what I experienced in my early 20s. I didn't know what had happened when I had my near-death experience. So I wanted to kind of understand that, but also to get into just expanding my awareness of all of these things that I had heard about, but never really understood. So growing up Catholic, very traditionally, there was no mention of reincarnation or anything about past lives. And so in my 20s, when I really began my metaphysical journey, that's when I got into this work.
You had the near-death experience at an earlier age?
Yeah, I was probably about 24 at the time. Would you like me to tell you a little bit more about that?
Of course, yes.
I was on vacation with a friend of mine. We were in Florida, and we were having a great time meeting other people around a pool area, and I dove into the pool, misjudging the bottom of the pool. And probably for your listeners, it's just painful even listening to the next part. I hit my head on the concrete bottom of the pool, and I remember hearing this sort of loud and hollow thud that happened. But right after that happened, I found myself floating up in the middle of the darkness of space, looking back on the earth. So I saw the earth spinning and I saw planets and stars. I really didn't know, of course, what had happened. And I kept on looking down to see my body because I still felt like myself. And I kept on looking to see my body, but of course my body wasn't there. But all of my thoughts and feelings, emotions, memories, everything was intact. I was still me, but I wasn't in physical form. So I was looking around trying to get a sense of things, and I was picking up this interior knowledge of me being on a grid, on this undulating grid, sort of a multi-level, multi-dimensional matrix. But I had my specific point on the grid, and I was connected to everything at once, but I was still myself. And I felt an incredible level of peaceness and calmness, which you've probably heard other near-death experience people describe.
Mm-hmm. Sure have.
It's so hard to describe because there's nothing on earth like it. It is just such a deep, resonant calmness internally. So as I'm sort of floating there in space, looking down, trying to find my body that's not there, I hear this voice, which on my Catholic upbringing, I was assuming was God, but I hear this voice say, "You can stay with me or you can go back." And I knew immediately what I was being offered, but at the same time, I was perplexed by the entire situation. And so I said, "What?" Which for me is always sort of funny that I'm asking God, "What?" And so I hear, "I'm giving you the option. You can stay with me or you can go back. This is the option that you have." And so immediately I'm thinking of my mom and my dad and my sister and everyone I know and my life as I know it. And I'm like, well, I want to go back. And Johnny, in an instant, I can't even describe how quickly, I'm back in my body. I'm gasping for air. They're pulling me out of the pool. They're like dragging me onto the apron of the pool and trying to get water out of my lungs and all of that. And I'm coughing. And I'm sort of getting back into my body. And I'm sort of really dazed. And everybody's like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" I'm not bleeding or anything. My head's not cracked open, nothing. And so I get up and I'm like a 20-year-old. You think you're fine. And you're like, whatever, I'm good. And so we just go back to the room and I lay down. And an hour later, we go out to eat dinner. And
everything's back to normal, right?
And everything's back to normal. I did not talk about that experience for like 10 years. One of the reasons was I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what happened. And it wasn't until I think I saw Oprah Winfrey had a near-death experience program, and I saw that, and I'm like, oh, well, that's what it was. And that's when I started to really kind of connect to it and understand it better.
That sounds pretty consistent from what I've heard. The conditions and the characteristics are are very, very similar. And I've heard a lot of people say, I really didn't want to go back, but I felt I had to, family and obligations and so on. And I was just about to say the average lag time between the incident itself and the report, when that person comes forth and says, I had an NDE, I had a near-death experience, is actually 10 years. The International Association for Near-Death Studies compiled the data on like hundreds of thousands of cases. And on average, people wait about 10 years because they don't know what it is. They're afraid people might think that they're crazy and so on.
And it was just so bizarre. It was so out there. I had no frame of reference for it. And of course, I never heard anyone else talking about such a thing.
Well, it seems like there's definitely a connection between the near-death experiences and the past life regression. This is your line of work, so it's a logical step in that direction. So as a regressionist, do you also explore the life between lives space?
I do. What I find is that when I am regressed, I'm able to kind of go into that life between life space, that sort of spiritual realm. I have been able to guide people. They've sort of taken me to that space when I've regressed them. What I find in my experience is that not everybody can kind of touch upon that space. My experience is that some people can go there and access that sort of spiritual realm, and some cannot.
When we talk about past life regression, I think most people know by now, it's fairly popular. You can do a Google search. I live in the West Palm Beach area, speaking of Florida, and I can Google that and I can find about 10 or 12 therapists. It's almost becoming mainstream. But the life between lives space, what Dr. Michael Newton wrote about, most therapists know of it, but most people that are familiar with near-death experiences and so on have not heard about it. Why do you suppose that is?
Well, I think that life between life space is still one of the uncharted territories as far as we're trying to understand it, we're trying to take it in. I think Michael Newton's work, for me personally, was so instrumental in helping me understand more about my NDE, but also helping me understand about the bigger perspective of reincarnation and the lives between lives and what happens in the spiritual realm as we're preparing to incarnate into a new lifetime. All of that, for me, helped to give such a broader understanding of our spiritual life, of us being spiritual beings having a human experience. So that really helped to expand this sort of very provincial knowledge or understanding of our lives and saying, okay, there's much more there. To this point, I've been regressed myself about 35 times. So I know about 35 or so of my lifetimes that I've had. And each one has helped expand my understanding of myself. And like many people will say, when you do a past life regression, it really does answer. It's sort of like putting a puzzle piece in place and saying, okay, this is what happened in that lifetime, and this is how it may or may not apply to what's going on with your life today. But it really answers, calms down, heals, really connects us more to ourselves.
That is consistent with what I have heard. Interesting that you mentioned a grid in your NDE, and then we started talking about life between lives a bit, because I did speak with someone who had an experience, and she was actually in that in-between space. She was actually shown a life that she had taken a slightly different path, and she was an empath, right? An intuitive that was teaching intuitives and so on, and she didn't follow that path because she was in a religious order. Speaking about provincial, right? Mm-hmm. But in that in-between space, she was actually shown if you had chosen that, and she said it looked like a grid. If you had chosen that, these are all the people you would have lit up. And like you said, it's a grid, and there's like several layers or levels, right?
Yep.
Okay, so it sounds consistent with what you saw as well. So now, speaking of the past life regressions, you probably have some stories to tell. What were some of the highlights?
Well, my very first regression, and you've probably heard this from other folks you've talked with, was I went back to a lifetime where I was being persecuted. I was in a religious order. I was a monk. I was being persecuted because I was talking out against the abuses of the Catholic Church. And at that time, and I think this was the 18th century, and I was not happy because the church wasn't giving back to the poor and really doing the mission of Christ as I saw it. And the abbot was very disappointed in me, and I was a thorn in the abbot's side. And so
Sounds familiar. I've heard this
you know,
before.
and so here I am speaking out against that. And what the abbot did was he had all of my brothers standing around me, three of whom are in my life today, in my lifetime today, as friends and a cousin. And he had them watching as they ran my hands through a mangle. I first went into that regression popping up off of my therapist's couch, looking at my engorged and bloody hands as far as what I saw interiorly. And so he wanted to punish me because in that lifetime I made illustrated manuscripts. So that was my showing my love for God, was using my artistry to create these illustrated manuscripts. And he knew that. And so the abbot punished me and took away my gift to God. The interesting part of that is that a couple years ago, I had another regression, and spontaneously the abbot came up into that regression and I forgave him. It was like all of that was then full circle, because then I really closed that chapter. I cut cords with those experiences and I healed that between me and that abbot.
What is the farthest back in time in your own regressions you were able to go back to?
What I was picking up was a lifetime, and I believe it was the 8th century. This was a lifetime where it was my mom and dad from this lifetime. They were my mom and dad in that lifetime. The scene opens up with me riding in the back of a cart. So they're in the front of the cart. A donkey is pulling the cart. I'm in the back. And we're going into the village to the market, going over a little bridge. And the donkey gets spooked, tips over the cart. Immediately, my mom and dad are dead. And I'm just like thrown out of the cart onto the side in a ditch. I'm like trying to help them, but they're dead. As a little boy, I think I was like 8 years old, I just start walking into town. I remember the scene is just me kind of wandering around looking at other people in the marketplace like, what do I do? I asked in that lifetime, sometimes the regressionist will say, what is your name? And that sort of stuff. Johnny, this was like a confirmation for me because it was hard for me to say that name. And the name was Hermeticlus. I had never heard of that name before. And so it was hard for me to even pronounce it. And so for me, that was kind of a confirmation that, okay, this is real stuff, that when we go back and do these regressions.
The obvious question, which a lot of people have, is how do we know whether that's a bona fide past life memory or whether it's your imagination?
Right. And so that was a nice confirmation for me. That was one of the earlier regressions that happened as well. So that helped to kind of give me a sense of trusting this information that's coming through. And what I would say today is that when working with people and doing regressions and getting this information that's coming out, for me as a therapist working with someone, it's not necessary that they're getting all of this information correct or they have the date correct or any of that. It's more important that we really look at what is the emotional wounding from that lifetime that needs to be healed. That really is the core issue. All of these other things make for an interesting story, but it really is the emotional wounding that needs to be healed.
Well, isn't it true that regression therapy, which has been around for a very long time, the objective was to find the source of an illness or a condition or anxiety, very much like Brian Weiss was doing with his patient, Catherine, right?
Right.
And he stumbled into one of her lives from 3,500 years ago.
And that's also what Edgar Cayce did as well. So you see all of this work is all of these thought leaders, these way showers, even Native Americans, even First Nations peoples, shamans that will take people on vision quests. What we're talking about has been around ever since people have been walking the earth.
I believe it is. And it's funny, when you just mentioned Vision Quest, I immediately thought of the 80s movie, Vision Quest, which is,
right.
I believe one of the kids, it wasn't Matthew Modine, it was somebody else. He had a Native American background of some sort. This is really, really interesting stuff. So do you have an example you could share where you did a regression with someone and you were able to take them to that life in between life space?
Yes. What I found was, let's say we regressed, they went to a lifetime, and then they came back into the spiritual realm. What was interesting for them, and I've seen with other folks, is that in that spiritual realm, it's as if they're suspended in this thing of like a control room, for lack of a better word. And so they're able to see, oh, if I go through here, that's what that's about. And they'll say, okay, I don't want to go through this portal or this door yet. I'm not ready for that. So what I find is that they're picking up energetically in that spiritual realm what they're ready to incorporate into their consciousness. Some are not able to illustrate or explain that in that way, but I think that that's really what's happening.
And that might at least partially explain why some people are able to access that space and some people are not. It could be that they're just not ready for it.
Their spiritual guides, their angels are saying this person is not ready to bring this into their conscious realm. They need to go through other things before they get to that. And I think that brings us back to a therapy approach with regression and hypnosis, is that a lot of people will say, oh, I want to go and do this. Will you regress me because I want to get rid of X, Y, or Z? And I'll say, well, let's talk first. Because what they're saying is, can we just skip over all of this stuff and get to what the real issue is so I don't have to work through anything? But really, there's so much self-examination they have to do before they get to that point. And that's exactly what my therapist did when I began with him. And I didn't know what he was doing in my 20s. I said, okay, you do hypnosis. Let's do a past life regression. I was all excited. He said, we'll get to that.
We'll get there.
So he had the presence of mind and the clinical knowledge to say, no, we need to wait for this. So that's what I would encourage your listeners to do. I know that it's exciting to do the past life regression, but the past life regression is really more of the icing on that cake, but it's not the cake.
When your therapist says you have some work to do, that sounds like a football coach saying you got to hit the weight room and you got to do some conditioning before you get out in the field. If not, you're at a pretty high risk of getting hurt.
That's a great analogy because you have to really prepare the table for the feast.
Right.
And so it's really preparing yourself to then have this expanded knowledge of yourself to then incorporate it into this is who I am and where I am today emotionally. And now this is what I know and I now understand about my past lives and what I've experienced. And this is how it plugs into where I am today.
Okay. You mentioned just now spirit guides, angels. I think if you traverse that life between life space, you would probably have to have run into a few of those.
Well, yes, I personally have. I've experienced where I've met I call them my counsel. And so this is about 10 to 12 people that I think about 5 or 6 are with me, or have been with me my entire lives, and the others come in based on what I'm experiencing and what I'm going through presently in my life. They're really there to be part of our intuitive knowledge. They're there to guide us if we're open to their guidance. They're there in service to us. They're not going to tell us what to do, but they'll certainly point like, oh, well, there's the light switch if you want to turn it on, but we still have to turn on the light switch.
Now, when you mention the council, is that the same thing as a council of elders, which is in the in-between space, or is that just a group of your guides? Because I've been told that there are several different types.
That's what I call the group of my guides.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's who travel with me. My understanding is that we also have each like one main guide. So my main guide, his name is Blackhawk. He's this very large man who's been with me my whole lifetime. The counsel is what I understand it to be. The more work that I do, the more I expand within myself, the more, let's say, refined the counsel becomes.
Interesting. That's one thing I've not heard, is that the more work you do, the more extensive your counsel becomes. I have heard from several people that different guides, like Blackhawk. That's so cool, by the way. I mean, who wouldn't want a spirit guide named Blackhawk? That's like your bouncer. And I've heard that. They're bouncers. One of my speakers I had on a while back mentioned one of his guides. He had like a really cool name. Like, it wasn't Blackhawk. I can't remember what it was, but he was this big burly dude that didn't speak, but he was there to protect him from any dark energy. You know what I'm talking about. So,
right.
And It's your belief that we all have guides.
That we all have guides, and that I believe that we all have a counsel per se. And so the counsel basically progresses in knowledge and wisdom as we progress in knowledge and wisdom. So they're tracking with us. And so that's what I mean, where some will kind of come in and come out based on how we've progressed. So for example, I wrote a book which came out last year, and what I've noticed is that since the book has come out and since I'm getting more interest about the book, and I have over 4,000 global readers now, that has kind of expanded my counsel. So I feel a difference in their energy that's with me. It's expanded greatly.
When we talk about expansion, spirit guides, and developing, what does this have to do with Ascension, which seems like almost everybody I talk to is aware of this?
I look at it in the terms of personal ascension. So what I think is important for us all to recognize is that this is not a race to ascend to the highest and the greatest and the best, because where we each are is exactly where our soul needs to be at this moment in time. As we expand our frequency, as we do more healing work within ourselves and elevate our frequency, we're going to the next level within ourselves. What I've been told is that this lifetime will probably be my last lifetime to incarnate in this realm, in the third dimension. Or
third density, right?
Third density.
Yeah.
And so then I'll go on to the next. But that doesn't mean that I'm better or whatever. It just means that I've done this work to get to that next level. And then I'll start at the bottom and go up from there.
Maybe you'll progress to be one of the council members, or maybe you'll come back as Gandhi did. And that brings up the question about ascended masters and so on. But before we get into that, both of us being raised as good Catholic boys, how have these things changed your view of religion?
What I say to people is that I feel very blessed, and I truly mean this, that I was raised within the Catholic faith because it provided a foundation for me to grow from. So I'm grateful for that. You know, I'm no longer a practicing Catholic, but I think that the Catholic Church and religious organizations serve a purpose for many people. I think that there are some more enlightened faith communities, but I'm very glad I had that foundation because I was able to then take from that and grow and expand from that foundation. What I find in my therapy work is that folks who have a fear of death or who experience a lot of anxiety in their lives, I will ask them, did you grow up in a faith community? And to a person, they will say, no, I did not. Or they'll say, yeah, we went, or it really wasn't that important to me. And so I think it's so important to raise children with some kind of faith-based organization. I don't care what it is. That faith community gives a solid sense within the child that they can call upon later if they so choose.
I would agree with that. I think church or temple or wherever you go to worship is a good place to start, but it's also up to you to expand beyond that. Past life regression and near-death experiences tell me something a lot different from what I'm hearing in church, but I think that you have to start somewhere. So
yeah, people have to start somewhere, and religion gives us some of the answers that religion believes. But spirituality, our personal spiritual quest, allows us to go and seek out the answers for ourselves. And so today I'm more spiritual than religious.
I think a lot of us are at this point. Speaking of all things religious, what is your connection to the divine today?
The minute you said that, I just got a big smile on my face and in my heart because I have such a wonderful, deep connection to God, to the divine. So God is always with me, always very present around me. And in times of fear or uncertainty, I know that I can call upon that energy to bring what I reference, his energy, into me for that sort of evergreen calmness. Mm-hmm. And so that's my connection to the divine today.
For those of us who have not experienced any of those realms, what is God? Who is God? Is it the universe? Is it the quantum realm? Is it all the same thing? Is it just an energy form? What is it?
Well, as I've experienced God in my meditations and in my deep healings that I've experienced, God to me is this big, loving, enveloping, energetic presence that doesn't have a face in the context of how we think of a person looking, but God embodies this unconditionally loving, energetic feeling that when you're in the presence of God, you are fully loved. Every part of you is embraced. We are each God's children. And I believe that when we die, when we transition, we go to God and God says, so what did you learn? Because we're walking the earth for God. And so when we go and say, well, God, I learned that I really love ice cream and popcorn and that fireworks are cool. And so we're telling all of, experiences. But with that, we're expanding God's consciousness. So we are bringing to God our consciousness and then adding to the collective consciousness of God's wisdom.
And the collective unconsciousness is basically shared by all of us, which then obviously leads us to the conclusion, or should I say the concept of oneness. Is that a fair explanation?
Yes, that's a great way to say that. And I believe that when we add our consciousness to the collective, that the frequency, the energetic experiences that we are bringing into that expand. I believe in many ways that's how the ascension is happening for the planet and for humanity based on that consciousness that we're plugging into.
So we're plugged in. We are exactly where we were supposed to be individually. Yes. At the end of the day, we are contributing to the universal, or otherwise known as the collective unconscious, which I think Jung wrote about.
That was all of his work.
Yeah, that was his scene. And I believe he had a near-death experience, which I didn't even learn about until like last month. It's interesting that he is obviously aware of that as well. Robert, thanks so much for joining us. Really, really great information here. How can our listeners find out more about you online?
So listeners can go to my website, theartofpracticalwisdom.com, where they'll learn more about my works and about my book, Healing Your Lost Inner Child.
Cool.
And it's also available on Amazon as well.
All right. I will put that link into the show notes. You've been listening to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. If you really liked it, you can also leave us a review on iTunes. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.